Let's also discuss the word rubber stamp. Malcolm, you used it. Everybody else been using it. But my question is really to Jia. As a Chinese reporter, how do you feel the NPC being called the rubber stamp?
I want to know what's your point.
I think rubber stamp is definitely a negative term, right? It implies that the NPC, which is this very important, supposedly very important group of people, basically just stamps everything that comes across their way and votes the way that they're told to vote. My personal view is that there are two things to it. The first is that if it is supposed to be, if we drop the term rubber stamp, then I think the NPC has to prove that it's capable of voting, with some sort of independence, which, historically until now has not been the case.
Are you saying rubber stamp is yet the best term?
I think it's not a perfect term, but it's an accurate description. The reason why I use rubber stamp, even though it's negative, and even though there is some debate over it, is because it's very difficult to describe to a foreign audience what the NPC is. Mm-hmm. Most people describe it as sort of China's version of parliament. Parliament is the most commonly used term. But the understanding of parliament overseas is very different, and it implies a lot of debate and a lot of, democratic action and basically individual voting and so on. And that's clearly not an accurate way to describe the NPC, so you have to qualify it with a certain term.
Talk to me about the other jargons you've been using to describe the NPC and the CPPCC.
This is really a significant problem for me as a Western journalist, and we spend a long time trying to work out a way to describe these meetings to people in the West who don't have any understanding of what they are and how they work, because actually there is no easy comparison. You cannot easily compare the two meetings to any other political system anywhere else in the world. And at the same time, even their names, okay, so generally readers don't like long names, and they also don't like when you shorten it to CPPCC, like nobody knows what that means. And also nobody knows what Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference means either. Nobody knows what that is or what it's for.
Is the term rubber stamp helpful?
I think it's helpful because of there is a translation problem between Chinese and English. And a lot of the words have one meaning here and have a different meaning, certainly to my readers. And I think that actually the Chinese government has been quite clever in co-opting the meaning of some of these words, particularly words like democracy and reform have a very particular meaning in China, and it's not the same meaning that they have in the UK. For example, Fu Ying was very clear she was asked about political reform, and she said, show me another country that's doing as much political reform as China.
像中国这样30多年如一日，坚持不懈推进改革，这在世界上我走过很多国家，也比较注意观察其他国家的这个情况，确实是很少见，在世界上很少见。
And in the sense that she meant it, it's absolutely true. She meant we're taking the system and we're changing it and improving it, and that's what we think is political reform. But if you were to say political reform in the United States or the UK or Europe, people would think it meant changing the system, which is a different meaning.
But I think the problem with this sort of oversimplified jargon is that when it becomes a cliche and you use it in the very first beginning of your story, does it create a tendency of a sort of a stereotype thinking which tends to overlook the nuance in politics?
Yes, absolutely. But I think all journalism is a very shallow representation of reality. We're basically trying to crystallize reality into 400 words in a way that will communicate some of what is happening here to people in England who have really very low understanding of what's happening in China. So,
but should the should a more self-demanding journalist refrain from using the
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that it's a negative term and it would be better to find a different way of explaining it. But at the moment, it's the most concise, kind of closest approximation of what is happening that I can think of. If you have a better suggestion, then, in a single word, then please.
Do you have a better suggestion, Jiajia?
其实我是觉得在这一届两会，我已经看到很多变化了。就是相对来说，以前大家可能觉得很多的委员和代表，我们也会听到，他们连自己是怎么被产生出来的都不知道，然后来这儿也是走个过场，开几天会就回去了，举举手笑一下，这也是很多西方的看不懂的地方，觉得中国两会。但是今年我遇到很多委员，他们敢说话、说真话、见真言程度。是给我留下最深刻的印象的。
比如说，
钟南山，他是曾经做过5年的政协委员，现在又是人大代表。他在小组讨论上就说，这个政府有很多新的口号，听起来很动听，但是如果你连这个呼吸的空气、吃的食物、喝的水你都做不到监管好，让每一个人放心的话，这些都是白搭。那我们坐在这儿开会没有任何意义。这个力度我觉得已经很强。然后包括这个俞敏洪委员。葛建雄委员他们提到异地高考，俞敏洪当时就是拍案而起，非常的愤怒，就我觉得有一点西方议会的这种氛围。他说，在北京40%的 GDP 是由没有任何身份的、没有任何户籍的、没有任何高考资格的人创造的，但是现在人被分成了3、6、9等，难道我们这些讲教育界别的委员还坐在这儿侃侃而谈吗？我们难道不应该马上去解决这样的问题吗？所以我觉得已经。就在我看来，因为我见证了这个进步和变化，我觉得已经是挺可惜的了。
I have a very negative view of this because firstly, when I interview delegates, they all say exactly the same thing, and it's always a very standard response.
Who have you been interviewing?
Well, I can't remember, but we've kind of given up interviewing the delegates. Well, no, we try. Generally, what happens is when the delegates come out of the Great Hall of the People. There are thousands of journalists there, and they cluster around individual delegates in groups, and they ask questions, like, well, what do you think about hukou reform, or what do you think about this? And the delegates always give like we're concerned with reform, and this is an important meeting, and it's important that I'm here, and everything's important, and we're gonna really, make some important reforms. And they always say just a very neutral. Well, in my experience, obviously I haven't interviewed that many delegates because there are so many of them and there's only one of me. But what I would say more generally is that at every NPC, I think there are lots of interesting ideas. Both the NPC and the CPPCC come up with lots of interesting ideas on an individual level. People have got good ideas about how to change China. Ultimately, I don't see many of those ideas actually making it into policy, right? Which is another argument for why, in its current form, the whole body is a bit of theatre, because we'd like to present to the world the idea that we're having a healthy debate about what should change in China, and I think that there is a healthy debate, but I don't think that their voices are particularly being listened to, because if we see some of it coming into policy, then I'm happy to revise my opinion, but at the moment. Show me where is the hukou reform?
Response?
有一些委员他们就提到一个顺口溜，是他们自嘲的，叫做“不说白不说，说了也白说，白说也要说，直到不白说。” You understand that? 他们是很无奈的，就是在现在这种情况下。另外，就是这次很多委员提到了一点，就是为什么两会的作用非常有限，这是因为这些人平时回去以后，他们是企业家，他们是校长，他们不会再去关心自己两会。这个代表委员的身份了，但是在西方很多的这个议员他们是专职的，他们1年只有10个月的时间在讨论，在提出来他们的建议，并且督促他去实施，要给政府施压。但是在我们中国目前没有这样子的，所以他们说能不能专职化，能不能就是随时向政府问责，这可能是能够突出改革的第一步，或者是把两会的这样的一个大家说作秀也好，这个表演也罢，能够让它能够实质化的。然后这个意见呢，也有很多委员提出来了，在今年的两会上，他们也期待一个反馈。
I tend to agree with Jiajia in which so much change has been incremental, which is the Chinese reform has always been.
I agree, and also actually, just to contradict myself, I think there is one very big piece of news so far from this year's Liang Hui, which is merging the Ministry of Health with the Family Planning Commission. I think removing the Family Planning Commission is a significant step. And, it doesn't mean that something's going to happen tomorrow, but the fact that the department responsible for administering the one-child policy has been removed means that, there will, at some point, be a significant change to the one-child policy.
Yeah. Do you think the new leadership will affect the future of China?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that what has been done so far is quite important, and the tone that they've struck so far is very interesting. It's a very different feeling already to the previous administration. And in politics, I think a lot of it is about feeling. That they're certainly putting forward the idea that things that are important to the public are important to them, right? Which is different from perhaps the slightly more detached sense that you got in the past. That you have some people in one part of Beijing that seem at times to have been entirely disconnected from what was happening elsewhere. I don't think you get that sense at the moment. I think that, clearly they know what's important and what they have to do, and they're working towards that.
Finally, some convergence. That's good.